Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be covering our last topic of this course, which is on user authentication. We're going to be talking about what user authentication actually is, what it means, and we're going to talk about how to perform authentication or implement authentication scheme in PHP using sessions. We're going to talk about different authentication methods that are available. We're going to talk about that after a user's been authenticated and they've been, for example, logged into the admin website and used it and they want to log out. We're going to talk about that process. And then we're going to talk about setting up our database so that we can add in our final lesson user authentication to our admin website. So basically right now we've been having the ability to add items, view orders, update items in the store, update departments, and so forth. Well, now we're going to add what you would, in our next lesson, we're going to add what you would expect for an administrative site like that, is we're going to add a way to log in with the username and password. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about setting up a table called users, which is going to contain information about user accounts to be able to log into that. Related to that topic, we're going to talk about a concept called password hashing, or just hashing in general. And then we're going to go over required homework, which is going to have you basically set up this user's database for our final web application development lesson. So basically, user authentication is used to validate the identity of a user. When someone comes to your admin website and they want to add an item to the store, you want to make sure that they're the appropriate person. So authentication on the web is pretty much often used to restrict certain content. Maybe you have a members only area and or services. So for our admin website, maybe we would only want certain people maybe in our organization to be able to add items to the store. Authentication is a way to basically restrict that ability to do these different things. And the most common authentication scheme, with which I'm sure all of you are familiar, is to have a user provide a username and password combination that uniquely identifies that user and is a basis for saying, this is who I am, and then after that, as sort of that authentication test is passed, then they get access to whatever services or content you would like to provide them. What you can do in PHP is we know about the built-in session functionality, and we can actually use that as a means to provide restricted access to our pages. So for example, provide restricted access to our admin website. And basically the way you do that is you go through a couple of different steps. The first step would be you would authenticate a user. So you would have a form where they would log in with their username and password, for example. When you do that, it would start a session. And there are various methods that you can do to authenticate a user. We're not going to get into that in just a second. We're going to talk more about the session-related part of it. So let's say a user logs in and they're authenticated. We verified that they're who they are. Then what we can do is begin a session and then set a session variable. Maybe we have a session variable called authenticated. And then basically on every page that we want to restrict access to, we can just provide a test on those particular page that verifies that this particular piece of session data is available in their session. Because what basically we're saying is if they're authenticated, they were able to create a session, they were able to create that session variable. If when they go to a page, they are able to access that session, that implies that they were able to successfully log in. So basically what, as mentioned, what you do on your particular pages you want to restrict access to is you just test for the existence of a particular session variable. Because when a user is authenticated, a session gets started, and then a known variable is set. And what's going to happen, as we know, assuming we're using cookie-based sessions, every time a user visits a restricted page, for example, they're going to pass along their session cookie. That session cookie is going to give them access to session data. If they've appropriately logged in, that session data will contain this authenticated, this variable that we're going to use as a means for authenticating. So as long as that variable is set, then we can say, okay, you have access to this, you've been authenticated, we're going to give you access to this particular page. So if we look at a script, first example script for this lecture called restrictedaccess.php, basically it's a page that we want to restrict access to only authenticated users. So at the beginning of the page, we start a session or continue a session, and then we basically perform a simple test on the session variable authenticated. And we're going to use that as our variable to test if the user has been logged in or not. And so basically we're running isSet on the session variable authenticated. If it's set is true, then authenticated variable is going to be true. If not, it's going to be false. Then in our content area, if the user is authenticated, meaning authenticated is true, we're going to output a welcome message. If not, we're going to say you must be logged in to view this content. Well, this portion of our web application, or this lecture example, doesn't have a login screen, so every time we go to this restricted access page, we're not going to be able to view that content. So if we go to version 1 and we click on restricted access, we're going to get you must be logged in to view this content. We're going to show in a second how to add the login form so that you're able to see that. So there are a number of different ways to authenticate users. You can have things like web server authentication, where you might use Apaches to allow users to access different sites. Another method you can do is you can have a PHP script that that a user posts or sends a get parameters to with the username and password, and maybe those username and passwords are hard-coded into a script, and it can just look up and say, okay, the username and password, if they're both this, then we'll give them access to it. It's not a particularly good example or a secure example, but that's one way that you could do it. Another thing that you could do is we know how to access files in PHP. So maybe a user could post a username and password to a script. That script will go ahead and look up in the file system that contains username and password combinations and see if that exists. If so, it will authenticate the user. What we're going to be using for our web application, and because this course is about MySQL and PHP web development, we're going to store our user data, username and password data, in a database. So when we authenticate a user, we're actually going to be running a query on the database and saying, does this username and password combination exist? So we're going to be doing that against a users table, and we're going to be implementing that in our next web application development lesson. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the users table coming up. But as far as just learning how these authentication methods, we're going to implement in this lecture example a simple authentication method where it just checks a password that it's equal to a hard-coded value in order to show how we can set that session variable so that we can see the restricted access page. So for example, in our version 2 of our lecture example, there's 2 pages now. We have restricted access, which is going to say you must be logged in to view this content. We haven't logged in yet. So if we click here, it takes us to a new page that we've created called login. And basically what we have is we have a login script that accepts 2 post variables, username and password. And basically what it does is it also starts a session at the beginning because we're using sessions to control our authentication. Basically all it does is it just checks that the password is equal to a hard-coded value, in this particular case password. So as long as the username provides a password equal to password, we're going to say, okay, you're authenticated. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to set that authenticated session variable. In this case, we're setting it equal to true. It doesn't really matter what value we set it to because all we're just testing for is its existence. So we go ahead and we set the authenticated session variable to true, and then we're going to redirect the user after they've logged into that restricted access page. So what's going to happen is the session's been created. Assuming they provided the password equal password, they created the authenticated session variable. They're redirected to access restricted access.php, which at the beginning it opens a session and it tests to see if that variable is set. Since it's now going to be set, when the user goes back to this page, it's going to when a user is forwarded to this page, it's going to check if it's authenticated. Now you're going to be authenticated, and you're going to get the welcome message as opposed to saying that you're not allowed to see the restricted data. So on our login page, it doesn't really matter what username we put in because all we're checking for in this particular case is a password. So I'm entering the password, and if you notice here, there's it's covered up by these black dots, which you've seen for sure in web application you've gone to, and that's basically just a special type of input field called password. It doesn't actually encrypt the password, but it's something if somebody's looking over your shoulder, they can't see it. So if I go ahead and click login, basically what it did is it went ahead and it validated that I provided the password. It created the session variable, redirected me to restricted access, and it says you're now in the restricted area. Welcome. So sort of the other process that involves with authenticating a user is what do you do when the user is done with a session? We've all been to websites where you log in, you perform some actions, and then you log out. So that way somebody else that comes into the computer can't just go up and have access to your data. If they wanted to do that, they would have to re-log in, which would be re-authenticate. So basically we're going to sort of, the logout procedure is canceling an authentication. And the way that you can do that is by simply destroying a user session. And the reason that that works is that the test that we're using on our restricted pages is just to test for existence of a particular session variable. If that user session has been destroyed, that variable is no longer going to exist, so they're not going to get access to those pages anymore. So if we look at a new version of our web application, of this lecture example, version 3. Let me just clear any cookies we have. If we try to go to the restricted access page, say you must be logged in, click here to log in. This script works the same as in the last example. It just takes as long as password is provided, it's a password, it's going to log you in. It's going to say you're welcome to the restricted area, and now it's going to have a button that's just going to go to logout.php. Well, all logout.php does is it destroys our session. And if we look at logout.php, we can see it starts the session, and it goes through that sort of 4-step process we talked about when we learned about destroying sessions in a previous lesson. It starts the session, it goes ahead and deletes all the session variables by setting session equal to the empty array. It goes ahead and it deletes the session cookie, does that by using the set cookie method or function and setting it to a time in the past. Then it calls the session destroy method, which after the script is over is going to delete all of that session data on the server. Because we've destroyed, and this is actually one of the reasons why when we learned about destroying sessions, we actually set the session variable equal to an empty array, because when we call the session destroy, that doesn't actually destroy the session data until after the script is ended. So if we were to leave out this deletion of the session variables up here, now we have a test because we have a test to see if the user was authenticated or not. If we hadn't deleted it, this would still show up as the user is authenticated. So basically, we've gone ahead and we've set it to the empty array, so the user is no longer authenticated. This particular case, authenticated is going to evaluate to false. And then we say, as long as the user is authenticated as false, it means the user was successfully logged out. We output a message that was logged out. If not, we're going to say there was an error logging you out, and that would happen, for example, if we had this commented out. So when we click on this link to logout.php, it's going to go ahead and destroy the session. Actually, let me bring up Firebug so you can see the deletion of the cookie. Click here to log out. You are successfully logged out. We can see that it has a set cookie method that actually deletes that PHP session ID cookie. Now, because we're logged out, just to verify, let's say we tried to go to restrictedaccess.php again. When we try to do that, it's going to try to access that session variable authenticated. It no longer exists because our session's destroyed, and we're going to get the message that says you must be logged in to view the content. So that's how the logout works. So the way we're going to authenticate, now that we've sort of learned about how authentication works and how to use it during sessions, we're going to talk about the authentication method that we're going to use for our web application, which is to use authentication from a MySQL database. So we're going to be creating a table called users, and it stores information about admin users for our administrative website. It's going to be defined by this SQL statement here. It's basically going to have 4 different columns, one for username, one for password, one for first name and last name. So we're going to allow it to set the first name and last name of a user, and then the username and password that they're going to log in as. We've noted the username as the primary key, and you'll notice that it's not an auto-incremented integer column like we've been using. And we can denote it as a primary key because we want to have a unique username. Usernames be unique for our admin users. And so we can denote that as a primary key, so if somebody tries to create an account for a username that already exists, they're not going to be able to do that. Now, one thing to note is this is set as a varchar, which means it can have a username up to 20 characters in length. These are variable length strings for first name and last name. However, for password, we've set it to a fixed length string of 40, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide. And the reason for that is we're going to use that to store a password, and we're going to be storing it in a special format. So let's go ahead and create this users table. Just going to type the create table statement. Our primary key is going to be username, which is going to be a varchar. To review was 20 characters in length, so it can be 20 character username. Password, as mentioned, it's going to be a fixed length field of 40 characters. We're going to see why in a second. First name, we're going to allow them to have up to 15 characters for their first name. Just double check that. And then 20 characters for their last name. So now we've created basically our users table. And that's what the structure of the table looks like. So let's say we want to add a user to the table, or add a user to our database. So insert into users, values. We're going to provide a username, J. Smith. We're going to have them use the password. Let's in this particular case just say password. Well, let's pick something more unique. Maybe it'll be his wife's name will be his password, Jenny. His name will be Joe, first name Joe, last name Smith. We can insert that into the table. Now when we view the content of our users table, we can see we have a username Joe Smith, password Jenny, first name Joe, last name Smith. Well, as you can see, our password here is stored in plain text, meaning anybody that can view our database can view everybody's password. So they'd be able to have access to their account, and that's a security risk. So what we're going to talk about in our next slide is how to obscure that so that anybody that looks at the database, if the database were to be compromised, they wouldn't be able to find out everybody's username. And the way we're going to do that is through a method known as hashing. And basically what it is hash is essentially a random string of characters that's generated by a function. Basically what you do is you pass a password to a hash function. It runs some algorithm, and that algorithm will generate a random string. The feature of a hash function is that if you pass it the same string, every time you pass it the same string, it's always going to generate the same output. So what we can do is we can run when a user creates a password, we can run a hash function that's going to generate the same key for that password every time it's entered. We store the hash in the database, which is going to be random strings. It's not going to be. It's going to be this long, ugly-looking string. And then the way we'd authenticate our user is when they type in their password, we run the hash function on the user the plain text password they entered, and then compare the two hashes, because we know that the hash is always going to be the same for the same username. And the other thing about the hash is they're generally unique. It's very hard to have two strings that would generate the same hash. So the chances of two passwords having the same hash value is very unlikely. Well, PHP provides two built-in hash functions that use two different algorithms. One is called SHA-1, and what that does is that generates a hash of 40 characters in length, and there's an MD5 hash which generates a 32 character hash string. We're going to be using the more secure SHA-1 to do that. And so when we have our PHP code, and we're going to see in our next application, our web application lesson, when we insert a user, we're going to be basically running this SHA function in PHP on whatever password string the user provided, and it's going to generate the hash. So we actually have a script here called hashexamples.php that basically shows we're basically running the SHA-1 method or function on the string password, and then we're also running the MD5 hash function on the word password so you can see what a hash looks like. When we run these this particular script, we can see that they generate these really difficult strings that would be hard for somebody to look at and remember. So for SHA1, it generates a 40-character string, and this is what it looks like for password, and it does that every time you pass it password. The MD5 hash function generates a 32-character string that looks like this, and so that's what we're going to be storing in our database. Now what MySQL actually does is they have analogs of those functions. They have a function built in called SHA1 and MD5 that do the same exact thing. Because these are defined algorithms, the SHA1 function for MySQL is going to generate the same hash value for password as the SHA1 in PHP does. So for example, one of the things you can do in MySQL, which we haven't talked about, is you can just run some functions. So if we run SHA1 on the string password, we can see that it generates the string 5BAA61E4. Well, if we look back at our hash example, 5BAA61E4 and so on. So it generates the same password. So what we're actually going to do to sort of get an initial account set up in our users table is we're going to add an admin account. So right now, we can see we have this one user in our database called Joe Smith, which we're actually going to delete because it's insecure with the password the way that it is. So we can see there's no more users in that database. And now we're going to insert an admin account. Into the users table. We're going to have the username be admin. We're going to have the password be the empty string. That's not necessarily a secure thing, but we're going to use it to be able to get our account set up to be able to. We'll use this to initially log into our what's going to be authentication protected admin site to create new accounts, and then we can get rid of this account. And the way we do that is we're actually going to run the SHA1 function on the empty string password. We're going to call the user, we'll give it the first name site, for example, and the last name administrator. Looks like I had an error in the code. Oops. And now when we run a select query on users, we can see we have an admin user, first name, site, last name, administrator, and we can see that their password is this 40-character hash that's quite ugly, so anybody looking at the database won't be able to just look and see, okay, the admin's username is admin, or the empty string. And that's why we made this field equal to 40 characters long, because that SHA1 function returns a 40-character string. Oh, and one other thing is, so just to validate that our admin account works, what we can do is we can run a select query on this users table, which is what we're going to be doing in our web application to validate a user, and say, does a user exist with the username admin and the password equal to the empty string? And if it returns a row, that means yes. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to say, select all the columns from the users table, and then we're going to provide a where clause, where username equals, in this particular case, admin, and password equals not the empty string, but equals the SHA1 hash of the empty string. And if we run that, we see that we get one row. If we had just run it with the password equal to the empty string, we're going to get empty set, and we're not going to see that it's used. Now here we've used the SHA1 within our SQL query. We're actually going to be calculating it in our PHP statement. So when we run this query, it's actually this SHA1 function is going to be replaced with the hash generated by the SHA1 function in PHP. So for the required homework for this is basically just to get that users table set up for use in our last web development application lesson. Just create the users table as we had demonstrated in this lecture with the different fields that we provided. Make sure that the password column is a fixed length character string of length 40, because we're going to be using the SHA-1 function in PHP to generate our password hashes. And then go ahead like we did and generate an administrator count with the username admin and password equal to the empty string. You can call it whatever you want. You can put your name if you need to. You're going to need to use the SHA-1 function that MySQL provides to be able to create that hash, because if you just run the insert statement with just an empty string, it's not going to generate that hash, and you'll actually have the empty string shown up in your database. So you make sure you use this function. And also the password is actually just the empty string, but the value that you're going to be storing in that password field is going to be the SHA-1 output of the empty string, so it's going to be that 40-character hash. And then like we did, run a select query on this new admin account that you created to verify that you can retrieve that row using username, admin, and password empty string. And so you're going to be basically running a query just like we did here, and that's going to verify that everything is set up and works correctly. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.